Yes, sir.
Could you just take one topic like the cancer thing you mentioned at the end, and just present the advances from your point of view that you could make that scientists who are working in this can't?
Okay, so if we consider 3D bioprinting, for example, there are a number of opportunities to do reconstructive surgery. So one of the things I've seen is that you have people that have developed facial tumors, for example, and it's horribly disfiguring. With 3D printing and 3D bioprinting, not only can you reconstruct the damaged portions of the skull, but you can also replace the damaged portions of muscle and facial tissue so that these people are able to go out and about in public. Is that what you're asking?
Well, suppose you have a brain tumor.
Sure.
Okay. And suppose it's not near the skull, so that you can't go in there, excise it, and so on. What do you do in this case?
So there are actually some advanced robotics developments right now where they're allowing surgeons to use robots to do more. They're very, very precise, minute movements using new tools, so that if you cannot get in there via traditional surgical means, it's too delicate to do, the robots are able to more precisely calibrate and get in there and start to manipulate the tissue and to remove the tumor. You also have some chemical treatments. There was one that came up maybe 2 or 3 weeks back now, and this is over in Europe. It's a unique chemical treatment that they're testing in women they've had success in. Gosh, I want to say it's more than 2 in 10. It might be more than that, in successfully treating certain types of breast cancer. And they've identified that the cancers are a conglomerate of diseases that are all working together, which is why it's so hard to treat it. So instead of using a single targeted medicine, they're now coming up with a group of medicines that are able to more efficiently target the cancer based on the new genetic design that they've got for it, the new genetic blueprint.
Yeah, my point is, isn't this just traditional science at the boundary?
Traditional science at the boundary.
Yeah, guys who are crackerjack, biochemists, biologists, MDs, scientists. No, isn't this just the forward motion of traditional science?
Some of it is, yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Isn't this the natural progression of science? Some of it very much is. Some of it is being done in hack spaces by people that have absolutely no training or background at all.
See, this is my point. I just don't. This is what I can't see. I mean, it's a leap here that somebody who doesn't know about the biology of what they're staring at can nonetheless make dramatic improvements in treatment. I don't see how you can do that.
Let me give you a great case. There's her name is Heather Dewey Highborn. She's an artist out of New York. She did a program called Stranger Faces, and what she did was she went to her local hack space and she said, hey, I don't know anything about DNA science or genetics or anything, but I want to see how much I can learn about somebody from just collecting their DNA. And the lab said, okay, we're going to teach you some stuff. And so once she got comfortable with these various processes in the lab, she went down her street and she picked up cigarettes, chewed bubble gum, hair, a bunch of stuff, and then she mined it for DNA. Once she had the DNA, she then went into a computer program available at the lab, used it to manipulate and identify genetic markers specifically for facial features. She then took those facial features, put them into a program, and 3D printed people's faces out that she'd never met before. She hosted an art show. She had them all hung up, and people came in and they were startled to see themselves. These were folks that lived further on down her street she had never met before. And she actually has a picture with some of these people posing with their face, and they're, how did you do this? It scared her so badly that she then went back to the lab and decided that, hey, I'm worried about my DNA privacy. And she came up with, it's 2 different bottles. I forget what they're called. I think one is Erase and one is Mask. But the product basically goes in and it will denature up to 99% of the DNA, and the rest is a conglomerate of DNA, so you can spray it around the space you were just in, and it masks the fact that you were there at all. This is somebody that was an artist with no biological or scientific background.
I just want to step in here. I want to allow questions from our students as well. Just take chair's prerogative, and then we'll certainly be able to circle back around.
Sure.
And so I just want to get a kind of collection of hands. Anthony, you have a question, and then and I'm sorry, could you Elizabeth? Okay, and I'm going to take also a chair's prerogative, and I've got a question here, but it's actually designed to eliminate an omission in the biography that I mentioned. Is that Major Snow has also briefed on this very research the National Security Council in February.
Right.
And
February.
so to sort of kick off with this question, what has been the reception, within the various U.S. Within the various U.S. government stakeholders, let's say, that you've engaged on this topic, and your thoughts and some of the possible policy solutions you provided. I mean, you've briefed at the highest levels of the national security sort of infrastructure within the U.S. government. I'm just curious, what has been the reception so far?
Very positive. Innovation is definitely the watchword right now. There's a lot of interest in how can we do more. We do a great job at on-ramping new technologies to the government, not so much on the collaborative side outside of industry. We're having a hard time reaching out to those makers and those biohackers and those hackers, and that's an area that we really need to get smarter on. So part of the reason I was sponsored to come out here is to begin developing those relationships and figuring out what that structure might look like, what type of collaborative structure would work best to facilitate these discussions, with the end result hopefully being smart technology policy that will evolve as these technologies move forward, not just static policy that is good for a snapshot in a period of time, but these ones actually will grow and evolve, and then even in some cases be able to anticipate potential offshoots from various technologies and address those aspects as well. That's a bit harder to do because some of these technologies are moving so very quickly right now. But it's an effort that I think if we're collaborating with the right technology partners and the right communities, the answers are out there. I know from talking with these folks this weekend, just remarkable people, and they really want to do the best they can on making sure these policies are well articulated, enabling innovation, but also protecting public safety where those aspects present a threat.
Excellent. All right. Anthony.
I actually have two questions, if
Sure.
that's okay. So my first question was ethical, I guess, and thank you for the talk, by the way. It's probably the most interesting talk I've heard. So, my first question was about the ethics, I guess, and here. So have you played the game Deus Ex?
I have not.
Okay, so that's
I'm
actually
familiar with
really
it,
good.
though.
It sort of answers these questions like how is technology?
I do have my pen. Hold on.
I actually know one of the original writers.
Oh, really?
We went to high school together, so.
Oh, it's one of my favorite games, so that's really cool.
So it's DEUX.
DEUX.
Right.
EX.
EX, got it.
It's like from 1990.
I've seen it. I haven't played it yet. I think it's on my Steam list right now.
Yeah.
So, okay.
That's very good.
Cool. I will check it out.
But it's about like they don't call it biohacking, but essentially it's that. And do you see there was like the prospect of self-regulation because at the end the character can destroy everything, but do you think that people are really looking at self-regulation in terms of biological enhancements or anything like that, and how are they setting sort of the standard of this might be too far for us to expand into?
Sure. No, that's a legitimate question, a really good question too. So the folks that I've talked to operating in those spaces are very aware of the public perception that they're kind of Frankenstein's lab, and so the FBI engagement with the biohackers helped to clarify some of that and show that, hey, they're actually doing bio for good. When you talk to these groups, there are a lot of people that will tell you safety comes first. they will push the boundaries of science, but they will try to make sure that they've got the proper safety protocols protecting that, to make sure that nobody gets hurt outside of it. Now, there are some folks that are always on the fringe, and they're always going to push boundaries, and those are the people that you've got to get to with the education, the ethical discussions. And I think these groups are doing a really good job of educating the new folks that are joining their ranks, and also getting the word out about, hey, if we're doing science for good, push the boundaries, but do so in a safe manner and do so in an ethical manner. And so we're seeing those discussions happening. The biohacker community jumps to mind because I see this happening on a global scale right now. I think they're being very effective at that approach.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And then the second one was technological. So one of the things you mentioned was the torrents. In terms of like the Pirate Bay, they're shut down by governments like I think Sweden or Norway or one of those Scandinavian countries, and they just moved to another one.
Exactly.
Which is I guess they're called the most resilient torrent site. How do you see any sort of manner that a website like that could be shut down, and if so, how would they go about that?
That's a really challenging space, and even within the hacker community, when I talk to folks, you're going to have a difficult time doing it just because of legislation right now. Within the U.S. and then outside of the U.S., you have physical boundaries that are preventing collaborative engagement on these spaces. So if I have somebody that's hacking the U.S., there's a good bet that they're not here, because if they're here, I'm going to try to roll them up and prosecute them, right? If they're outside of the U.S., it makes it much less likely that I'm going to be able to do that. So they're very smart about how they're setting up. They're also decentralizing in a lot of cases. And many of the hackers that I talk to, when you're talking about dark web operations, you've got significant criminal enterprises that are involved with this. They are following the path of venture capital. They are adopting these technologies very rapidly, and they're doing it faster than law enforcement, military, or the government can. They're businessmen and women. So I think we're going to have to really take a solid look at that. And one of the biggest challenges is making sure we have people that are familiar with the dark web, because sometimes I'll walk into a room and I'll start talking about Tor and the dark web, and people are like, whoa, wait, what are you talking about? Education, we got to get people smart on what it is first, and then we need to figure out, can we engage those communities? Because you're talking about a lot of criminal elements, you're talking about a lot of elements that are hard to approach in that manner. If we can't engage them, then what should we be doing? Because you're right, every time we shut down a site, 3 or 4 more pop up, and they're learning lessons from how we figured out where they were and how we shut them down last time. It's a very complex space. I don't have an answer for that one in particular, but there are a lot of discussions underway. So if you've got ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have
Thank
any,
you.
but
Thanks for the game tip. That's getting bumped up on my Steam list.
Yeah.
So.
So,
Elizabeth, I think. Yeah. Hey.
Thank you so much. I also have 2 questions. But it's interesting what you said about you'll start talking about Tor and nobody knows what you're talking about because the Navy invented it. So
yeah,
kind of weird. But my question kind of goes along the same lines as Anthony. When it comes to the concept of self-regulating communities, I'm not at all familiar with hacker or maker communities. I'm more focused on dark web type communities, which probably makes this a pessimistic question. But when we look at like Silk Road and DPR, there's kind of an ideology attached to those communities of complete autonomy. And I guess what my question is, when it comes to hackers and makers, that's not an ideology unique to the dark web or this kind of fringe people. How do they rectify that ideology when it comes to actually self-regulating? What are they doing that's different from dark web communities, I could say?
So there's a hacker ethic out there. If you Google it, it'll bring up the hacker ethic, and there's also the site etiquette that talks about online behavior, what's appropriate and what's not. A lot of the online communities will follow those, but then when you go into the communities, they have their own set of standards that they follow. Every new person that joins the community will be invited in, and first and foremost, they get the standards. Here's what we expect. You're going to contribute X number of hours as a volunteer. You're going to participate in these trainings in order to use the lab equipment or the make equipment. Oh, and by the way, if you do this, this, and this, that could potentially violate the law. So please don't do that. If you do it, we're going to disinvite you. So you see very specific guidance coming from each one of these communities to their specific members. with the biohacker community, we're seeing this go global now because they understand the fears. So they're kind of doing a public outreach to say, hey, we're not scary, we're here to help, we're doing really good things, which they are. And by the way, here's how we're training our members and educating them to do science smartly. When it comes to the dark web, you have hackers that will float back and forth between the dark web and regular web. Some of those hackers will have specific ethics that they follow, some of them not so much. It depends on, am I talking to a white hat, am I talking to a black hat, what are their priorities, are they doing a limited operation where they're working for a specific goal that's important to them. You see this with hacker collectives. So if you look at Anonymous, for example, people get really confused about Anonymous because they're going after ISIS and they're taking down sites that have hate speech and everything, but at the same time, they come back and they hack the government. So I'm not sure that the message there is everybody thinks that they're all one group of people going along the same line, when in fact, there are multiple groups of people or individuals joining up for short periods of time for a common goal, and once that goal is achieved, then they go back to their separate communities or their separate interest areas. With the dark web, you see people come together for short-term goals, whether it's monetary or business goals, but the ethics there vary quite a bit because you have a criminal element. And so depending on the group, they have their own specific ethics that they may follow or standards that they may follow, and depending on the individual. And you see a pattern where people are beginning to hire groups of folks from the dark web to do specific tasks, and you're not going to a specific group, you're putting an advertisement out, and these people are self-assembling into teams. So you might have somebody that's a scripter, you might have somebody that is, really good with Java, you might have somebody that's really good as a cracker in a certain area, and they'll all come together as a team to meet a certain requirement that's been put out there. I think, does that get at what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
My second question had to do with when you mentioned fusion centers.
Sure.
We had a guest speaker a couple days ago talk about the differences between Homeland Defense and security, and how you can't request federal help or federal reimbursement for certain local natural disasters until you've proven that you've used local resources.
Right.
And then he put kind of a slide of all of the main threats, and of course it's natural disasters, terrorism, and then cyber threats. And someone asked, if you're not using private resources, local resources that can combat cyber threats, then how is the government organizing all of this? And he really didn't know. Mm-hmm. So how can, local cyber initiatives combat that in kind of a way that would be legal with Homeland Defense versus security?
Great question. I would refer back to the I Am the Cavalry folks. I Am the Cavalry's motto is technology that you can trust. They are one of multiple groups that you'll find online that are operating at a local net level or trying to have local to national level effects. They saw a problem with the Internet of Things, and they started to see issues with ransomware, with hacking of various devices around the home, the medical device piece. And as they started to see these problems, they began to engage on the behalf of government because they realized the government lacked the capacity to engage and the expertise to engage in a lot of these spaces. The guys that I spoke with, Josh Corman, Alan Friedman, and Bo Woods, all did startups, they're all hackers, but they see the importance of doing this and leveraging their expertise to help out at that local level, and then go back and brief Congress. So for an example, they actually briefed the FDA on a threat to a specific medical device, and the FDA said, well, by policy, we've got to allow this process to complete X, Y, and Z. So you have to have so many injuries or so many deaths before we can start to move forward on it. And the I Am the Cavalry guys came back and said, well, how about we don't follow that policy and let's be proactive about it, and here's how, and look, by the way, if you're proactive, you'll save this much amount of money and will help this many people. And the FDA said, wow, that's pretty cool, let's make that happen. So that's how you're seeing some of these local hacker groups and maker groups engaging at a level with their expertise and leveraging it on behalf to help educate the government, but also help them to think in new ways about these problem sets where, as you said, maybe we're not doing the best job we can be doing. These are areas that we can improve in, and I think these tech communities have some of the answers. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Cool.
Okay, the next round of questions. I just want to get a sense. Okay, and so I'm sorry, Kyle and Jessica and Stephanie. Okay, so great. Okay, Kyle. Yeah.
Hi. Hey. My question actually kind of is pulling off of the potential government outreach, like what you said happened with the biohacker community, and then pairing that with different future policy implications. Because it sounds like almost the biggest way we can interface with these growing threats and the growing kind of tech explosion really is outreach. Mm-hmm. Is there any other policy kind of changes that can be made simply from the government side? Because I know it's really hard for, especially the government right now with the giant age gap and not trusting these communities in themselves. It's hard for them to put all of their trust in the communities to self-regulate. Right. So kind of is there a good bridge right now that kind of goes halfway, or the things that can be taken on the policy side that can take like the first steps towards that, or is it really just kind of a vague leap that seems to be the biggest? Right.
That's a really good question. What I'm seeing are small micro movements by both the government and the hacker and the maker communities. Mm-hmm. You have individuals that are finding opportunities to best partner. So for example, I talked with the maker community yesterday, and what they were telling me is they're being pulled in a lot by Department of Energy because they have unique expertise in a variety of make areas, and the labs, the national labs, maybe don't have the capacity or the money, so they're looking for new ways to help out and find solutions. The maker community has those answers, so they're trying to build these almost focus communities or topic communities around specific requirements and getting the maker community to engage and to assist where there's interest. You had the Department of State doing the nuclear challenge. They held a working group up at Stanford. That was really cool. We had a good mix of, hackers, makers, government, and military folks. So really awesome, right? Yeah. That's the kind of stuff that we need to do more of. But one of the feedback pieces I got from the hacker and maker communities this week was, hey, it's cool that you guys do that, but we have a really hard time with it because government gets paid to go to these meetings and attend. We don't. We take time off of work. We're paying the fees ourselves. And a lot of times they get very frustrated because the end result, they either don't get feedback on what actually came out of it. Did it affect a policy change or another change? And what was the final report? And did we have an impact? And when they don't see that feedback loop doesn't exist, there's a lot of hesitancy in why should we participate? Why should we engage? Because it feels like it's more targeted towards the government and less so for us. And in some cases, the more critical feedback was that it feels like in some cases these meetings are being held outside of areas where we are able to attend, so it seems like our participation is not desired. So we have a lot of gaps, big gaps that we need to work on building bridges across. On both sides, and we have a lot of discussions that need to take place more so than just working groups. Engagement efforts like what I'm doing this week, face-to-face meetings where you're sitting down, you're coming in as a government representative and you're saying, hey, tell me what your concerns are, tell me the good, bad, and ugly of the situation, tell me what you think we should be doing and how we can do it better and be a better partner. And then let's figure out a place where we can meet and start to make this work and start to move this relationship forward. They're very receptive to that because they want people to listen. And a big part of the problem is a lot of the times we come in as government members and we have our mission in our head and we know what we need to do and we kind of charge in, okay, here we're going to do this. And before the tech communities even had a chance to say anything or maybe point out, well, you guys didn't think about this aspect, this should be a concern. That discussion doesn't happen. That's the discussion we should be having. We need to go in and listen more than we speak at first. Cool. Thanks for your question.
So my question is more regarding human resources and kind of the intelligence operations overseas.
Sure.
Human resources, are they aware of any kind of strategies or policies in government now where they're trying to recruit people that are in a broad sense that have these kind of backgrounds,
Sure.
especially since you have, excuse me, such a large number of baby boomers retiring, and you just kind of have this huge drain of brain drain there, and then it doesn't seem like there's any kind of concerted effort to attract large numbers of these kinds of people. And also, the U.S. seems like it's been historically not the best at human intelligence, but that's going to become more important with these technologies. I don't know. Are you aware of any strategies that are affecting how we look at intelligence gathering?
Sure. So to your first question, the recruitment question, that's definitely challenging. I know NSA does a really good job. They try to go out to the conferences, and what I've heard back from the hackers and makers is, why don't you guys come to us, come where we live, or come to neutral ground and let's have these discussions. I know CIA does some of that recruitment, and there's some other organizations that are doing that as well. From a military standpoint, I think we need to do more. Just my own perspective, I know there are some programs out there that are trying to promote technology capable folks to coming in, and they're offering bonuses for that. But it's really hard to compete when you have a kid that is getting a 3-figure salary right out of high school because they've invented some code or some app. The hackers I spoke to this weekend were very frank about that. They said, yeah, we'd love to help, we'd love to make a difference, but for me to travel across country out of my own pocket, take a 50% pay cut, and then my ability to innovate and perform the way I can freely out here is then boxed in by this C2 structure that's the government. They're not interested. And I think the job aspect is the biggest piece. It's not so much the money, but it's more, if we can operate freely the way that we're able to and be creative and have that option to kind of bring that autonomy with us, we're going to be much more effective at the job. But they don't feel like the government will give them that space to operate. So that was I'm glad, thank you for bringing that up, because that was an interesting point that came up over the weekend in discussions. To the second question, yes, human intelligence is always a challenge. That's really hard, and it's getting harder nowadays because you have so many technologies that are out there already collecting and doing pattern of life surveillance and looking at various aspects of what's happening throughout society. There are possibilities to build unconventional capacity in this area. The problem is we need to be very transparent about how we do that. If we approach these communities and we're not forthright with, hey, our intention is to actually do some type of collection, and they find out about it, 2 things happen. 1, your operation gets burned entirely. 2, you've built a whole bunch more distrust, and we've got enough of that out there now. So if we're going to undertake any kind of program like that, we've got to be very open if we're including these various groups. One of the statements that was made, and this really caught my attention this week, was you guys are recruiting specific folks to act as agents within the tech community, and the people that are doing that are people that want to do it. And the comment that followed was, you guys should be looking at the people that aren't interested in doing that, because the people that want to do it have an agenda. I hadn't thought about that before, but it was a very good point. The people that aren't interested, they want to make a difference, but they're not interested in being an agent. Some of them have better accesses, some of them understand the technology a lot better, and some of them would be better partners. And that was emphasized to me during these discussions. So that was, again, I learned so much this weekend, a ton of remarkable folks that shared some really innovative ideas, and I hope that continues. Thanks for your question. Who was next?
I just want to, we talked a little bit earlier about the work that we've been doing outside of the U.S. on some of these issues, and that was kind of my question is, what have you seen, if you were saying, IBM was going to add in manufacturing, but basically any of these threat areas or disruptive technologies that you're talking about, what have you seen on how outreach has been going internationally on some of these issues or what do you think the options are? If you haven't seen that, what do you think the best options would be? Because I would think, particularly, you looked at additive manufacturing, and that's something that's spreading globally, and it's not something I particularly think is going to be a U.S. specific policy that's going to make the biggest difference. It's something that's going to have to go outside our borders. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
So no, yet another great question. This topic came up as well. In fact, yesterday I was talking with Dale Dougherty, and he highlighted some very unique opportunities for diplomatic engagement in this area. In fact, Department of State is sponsoring a number of maker fairs, and what is coming out of them is you have people that are in refugee camps, or in this particular case, some folks that were operating out of the Maker Fair in Cairo, Egypt. You had 2 students that came in with tech designs, very simple in nature. One was a bomb detector, or a bomb detection system. And so they were very curious, what does that mean? What is this for? And the student said, well, sometimes we can't get the authorities to come in when we see something. They have a big problem with World War II mines that are still laying around. And he said, so we want to go see what it is, but we don't want anybody to get close and get hurt. So I use my Arduino to create this, and it has like a little claw that goes out and the camera can focus in. And he goes, and I can use this in my community to go check out what might be a potential landmine, and then we can mark it off to keep people from stumbling over it until the authorities get there. Very cool, right? Very cool. They had some folks operating out of some of the refugee camps and bringing 3D printers in, or the ability to make things, even at a small scale level, was giving people hope. They feel like they're trapped, they're stuck in these camps, their future is very uncertain. But when you bring these technologies in, not only are they able to leverage whatever expertise they've brought with them from their home countries, but now they feel like, okay, I have some level of control over my life and what's happening in these camps. I've got some level to influence something positively. And so they were making different parts and pieces that would help out around the camps. Maybe repair a tent, replace a tent pole, tools that they needed that they didn't have that they had to leave behind. So that became a very positive, reinforcing theme for these camps. And that's a way to get people to participate, and also a way to maybe get their minds off of the situation they're in and let them do something productive for a while. So I see some, and then there are a number of groups online that I can point you to where there are engagement opportunities, particularly in Europe, but you're also seeing this a lot in Asia too, where there are engagement opportunities between the biohacker communities and the government or local members. You have the Enable project, which is global now, where you have amputees that can't afford replacement limbs, and that matches them with 3D printer capable organizations or individuals who will then take their measurements and design a custom 3D printed limb for that individual. That's really cool because that's gone global now, and I forget how many limbs that they've produced. But you have kids, you have adults, you have people that have been making do without for so long, and when you see the pictures and the videos, my gosh, it changes a life. And it's a small thing. You can print one of these prosthetic devices in about 200 hours, depending on which model you have, or some people are missing just single fingers. Those you can make in 4 or 5 hours, and it's not expensive, and it's very effective at building that capacity, that unconventional capacity. So yeah, I see a lot of State Department outreach in this area, which I think is really good. And I think this is something that perhaps the UN or maybe some other organizations will be looking at if they're not already. Does that help?
Well, I'm also thinking of the more, you're talking about the positive uses of the outreach, but dealing with some of the negative impacts of the different threats that might be out there. I mean, that is also, I'm wondering, actually, now that you brought up some of these positive ways, that is a way of also having that same kind of, or having a similar type of outreach, discussing the threats and how this is posed, and how, like talking more about like codes of conduct and that type of thing. But so I see that a lot in the U.S. environment, but I haven't seen it when I've looked at internationally.
So one of the projects I provided some tech support, tech advice on was a collaborative project to engage with the Singapore Embassy to kind of look upstream of potential counterproliferation threats. The team went over there and they did a tabletop exercise which was focused specifically on additive manufacturing and figuring out what could they do to influence how that 3D printer was used to prevent it from being used for a nefarious purpose, for maybe a nuclear component or nuclear parts, or we didn't explore chemical or biological, but that was a discussion that was had as well. And what we found was, there are some options to make material changes or to interdict upstream of the technology that don't impact the ability to innovate, but it does impact the ability to produce those specific parts that are of concern. So that was a really good discussion, and following that, that was also briefed up at the White House when I was up there on the 11th, and very well received. And there are a number of other embassies and entities that are looking at how can we begin to adopt this process to help regulate, in this case, additive manufacturing, but I think that same process may be adopted across multiple technologies.
Okay, Shay, and a gentleman in the back.
Francisco,
and so Shay.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about how some of these groups are sort of working to establish internal codes of conduct. Mm-hmm. Like you talked about the biohackers, how they're doing a pretty good job at that. At the moment, I imagine that's a rather small community relative to some of the others. What sort of happens to these codes of conduct when the barrier for entry into these communities decreases and a lot more people start joining them? How do you sort of maintain that, like for example, the internet used to be fairly limited, there was only a few people who had access, and there was sort of a code of conduct with that. Now everyone has access. Right. And there really isn't any sort of code of conduct. What happens, is the same thing going to happen? What do you think?
Yeah, so we're already starting to see that, because originally you had hackers that would be coding, and it was intricate code, and people were respected for the hacks and the exploits, and that was what they gained recognition for. But now you have script kiddies, and they have purchased parts and pieces and put them together to conduct attacks. That's changed everything. So yeah, you're exactly right. The point and click technologies and the abilities to kind of lower that ability to enter and successfully deploy these technologies, leverage them, is going to cause more challenges. This is part of that transition phase that I mentioned, where you're going to see these exponential effects as the technologies become more prevalent, sweeping across the globe. And that's something that we've got to start talking about now, because as you pointed out, we have a lot of challenges with internet crime. We have a lot of challenges with regulating the digital environment, and what does that look like for the future? And what policies do we have that still apply, and what policies should we be thinking of to regulate specific aspects, maybe not the whole technology because we still want that innovation, but regulating those threat aspects that do cause a concern for crime or for public safety or national security. What does that look like? I don't know yet, but I definitely think that the answers are out there, and as I'm talking to some of the tech community members, they already have some thoughts on it. I think self-regulation is something that they are very favorable for, and they're willing to take that responsibility on, because the online culture takes credibility very seriously. People can't see what you look like. They don't know your race, your ethnicity, your religion. They don't know any of that online. What they do know is what you bring to the community, and that's how you're valued. If you come online and say, hey, we're going to do this, this, and this, and everybody's going to follow this particular code, and you're one of the members that chooses not to, I've seen flame wars, I've seen people doxxed to authorities, I've seen people that have been banished from communities, and then I've seen minor punishments where they're restricted from accessing certain resources. Kind of a slap on the wrist of, hey, you did wrong, you didn't follow our guidelines, so now we're going to punish appropriately, and don't do it again. Let's educate, let's be smart about it. So I think the opportunity to allow self-regulation exists, and I think it will be a really good capacity building piece, because the government can then focus limited resources in on just those problem areas. We don't have to regulate the whole community, they're already doing it. So I think that's where we need to go next. Does that answer? More or less?
Yeah, more, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I didn't have anything to add.
Okay. All right, cool.
It's Francisco.
Thank you for the presentation. It goes in a little tangent from your presentation. but it seems to me that a lot of this technology serves as a bridge between virtual and reality, and it has a lot of dual-use repercussions for national security. My question is, do you see if it gets bigger, cryptocurrencies being a threat to national security or international security through the financial system, and how these groups see cryptocurrencies as a threat?
So there are a lot of interest in cryptocurrencies, a lot of discussion over what this does for threat finance as far as being able to track finances moving through illicit channels, because they're now going outside of traditional channels. The discussions of how we regulate those spaces, very complex right now, because you have not one, but I think it's 700 different cryptocurrencies in existence. So it's a pretty big space to try to tackle. The discussions that I'm seeing in this area in particular, from the government side, focus on how can we create a legitimate way to regulate these cryptocurrencies. But the problem is you can't just do it from the government side. That goes back to the collaborative piece, because you now have non-state actors involved. They have to be involved in regulating, and there's got to be some self-regulation, because if you try to impose regulation on something like the blockchain, it's digital. It's very hard to do that, and especially across transnational boundaries. They'll just move to a new country, and internationally we don't have one regulation for this, so we need to start thinking more globally in our legal approach. I think some of these cryptocurrencies are going to become legitimate and come online for legitimate use by the public, and you'll see them adopted more and more, and that will lend itself to the aspect regulation. But I think things like Dogecoin or Darkcoin are definitely going to remain part of that underworld network, that dark web network, because things like Dark Wallet, where you have multiple transactions that are coming in that are overlapping, so that if you buy a pair of socks and I buy a box of meth, nobody knows. There's a 50% chance. So if I'm trying to take one or both of us to court to say, I know you bought this, well, no, there's reasonable doubt there. So you have some really innovative techniques being employed in the digital environment that are complicating the legal aspects. And that's a discussion that I don't think has been had, at least not in spaces that I've been in. We're kind of talking around it right now. Nobody's sure how to get at it, because again, it's moving very quickly. And then you also see the blockchain being adapted for things like contracts and online gaming. So you have some other spaces that originally it was just cryptocurrencies. Now it's expanding out and having other effects. It's going to be really, really, really challenging and really interesting to see what happens. I don't have a good answer on what the regulation picture will look like for the future, or even what that interdiction picture will look like, because as the technologies become more advanced and we see more anonymizing tech adopted to kind of hide or disguise the transactions, it's going to be harder to target or harder to determine who's doing what, who's doing legal versus illegal. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool.
So first of all, it was a fantastic talk. I learned so much. Really, really amazing.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can put this in a clear way. I guess if you have so many communities and they're not really, there's no governance or anything like this, and probably they would want that kind of governance.
Right.
So how do you know who to engage with? How do you start that process of talking to them?
Sure.
Because you don't really have a leader, and they probably don't want any leaders.
Right. What I'm finding with the online digital culture is that you have founders, individuals that are
like Dale.
Yeah, like Dale or like Peter Shipley. I talk with him. You've got these people that have made tremendous strides for their specific communities, and those are the folks you start talking with. I talk with John Gilmore of the EFF. We've been corresponding back and forth, and I got a chance to meet with his team yesterday. Fantastic folks, a lot of ideas about how we can start to move forward in these spaces. But you've got to get in the door first, and you do that by listening. I think the discussions that Don and I have had have been really illuminating for me, because I'm coming at this from a government perspective, and some of the questions I was asking were very much with my government hat on, and they were off-putting to the community, which I didn't realize But he kind of, and my friend Tim Pozar also made some comments and said, hey Jen, you need to couch this differently because it sounds like you're just expecting the tech community to do stuff. What's the government going to do too? I said, oh, didn't even think that way. So now I'm trying to approach it from more of a, hey, how can we help each other? What do you expect or need for the government to do in order for us to get to these conversations? And some of that is, we've got some messy discussions that we're going to have in order to advance this. A lot of the folks that I knew were folks that I had gamed with, were folks that I had met through my tech engagements, folks I had met through the labs. Those people then introduced me to other people, and because they had the credibility within these different communities, I was welcomed in and people were willing to talk with me. I think that's part of it too. You have to be able to speak the language. If you send somebody in and they don't understand the culture, they don't understand the language, it's no different than foreign internal defense. Why would you send somebody who's an Argentinian expert to work in Afghanistan with no training? They're not going to know the language, the cultural nuances, any of that, and so there's a greater chance for any kind of collaborative efforts to fail. We've got to approach the cyber environment from a foreign internal defense perspective. It should be a diplomatic engagement, it should be a partner engagement, it should be how can we strive and make each other better. I think that's the right starting point for these discussions. Because if we go in and we're saying, well, we're going to do this, this, and this, not only do we not fully understand the technology or what potentially could spin off from that type of response, but we're going to further isolate these communities, and we don't have the expertise and the access we need to really address these technologies as effectively as we could if we're partnering. Does that answer?
Great.
Cool. All right. Awesome.
I've got a quick question.
Sure.
This sort of ties in a bit with the Tesla example.
Yeah.
But your presentation touched upon sort of the do-it-yourself communities, the hacktivist communities, and so forth that are somewhat small, maybe amorphous, and then we've talked about the U.S. government, the Department of Energy, Department of State, national security bureaucracy, and so I'm curious, I guess in particular, about the small user communities, the DIY groups, and so forth. What is their view of, let's say, the traditional private sector? Tesla, Google, you can even put Google in that category just because of its size.
Sure.
and how large it's grown. And I guess I'm interested in perspective on those, let's say, large traditional private sector actors. And then, do you see a particular what would you envision their role to be in some of these dialogues as well?
The industry actors?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Great question. So a lot of the folks I talk to have either helped start up these larger companies or have had a role in one of the sub-company startups, and they've sold them off to the larger companies. Many folks will bounce back and forth between the industry and the national labs, or the industry giants and the tech community, and they may go work for Google for a while or SpaceX for a while, and then, okay, I'm done with that, I feel like I've met my goal, or I've accomplished what I wanted to. Now I'm interested in this area, I'm going to go set up my own business, or I'm going to go partner with this team over here. So you see a lot of innovators that are bouncing back and forth within the large tech community down to the hacker and the maker spaces. I think that's great because the tech community folks that we've been talking to are aware of the challenges. They're approaching it from more of a strategic perspective and definitely with a business lens to that perspective. But they're also aware of these various groups because they're participants. They're makers, they're hackers, they're biohackers, they're wetware specialists. So when you go and you talk to them, they'll give you their industry perspective, but they'll also give the personal perspective too. The industry folks that we've been working with, Apple, Microsoft, et cetera, these guys, they get the challenges that the government has, and they're helpful in that. And in some cases, I find that with regards to technology, they can almost help us best articulate what those challenges are because they see them before us. Again, they're using and making the technologies first. but they can also see some of the pitfalls that are ahead of us and warn us about them. If you guys haven't heard about it, Silicon Valley Comic-Con was held, the first one this year. It was awesome. Tons of tech talks. Steve Wozniak was there, Palmer Luckey was there. They did a really great talk about virtual reality and augmented reality. And this was like a founder's fireside chat. And I loved it because they talked about the future of AR and VR. What does that look like? How's it going to impact business and social spaces, medicine? And then what are some of the challenges with regards to regulation? Of course, Apple and the encryption discussion came up. And Steve Wozniak basically came out and said, hey, we've worked with government before. The approach that was taken, you know, we didn't appreciate that because we can help out, but there are better ways to do that. There are more collaborative ways to do that. And so they did address it in an open forum, and I found that was really refreshing because they're willing to talk about not just the positive side of the technology, but also some of the challenges that they see on the horizon and what they think might be happening. So if you start to go to these Comic-Cons and stuff, you'll find people that are hackers and makers in the crowd, and like me, they're huge sci-fi nerds, and so they'll be willing to talk to you about what those various perspectives are. Silicon Valley Comic-Con is one of the main ones because you have so many technological users and innovators there in addition to the regular Comic-Con crowd. So we had people that were 3D printing pancakes. We had people that had virtual reality goggles that they were using. We had guys that had like all types of drone capabilities they were trying out. You could try them out too. We had people that had 3D printed entire costumes, suits of armor, like from Destiny. Oh, it was awesome. It was totally awesome. Yeah, I was majorly geeking out. And then they also brought in tech experts from the community to come talk. They had the guys that had, I can't remember their names now. It was a panel that talked about the physics behind Ant-Man. What was right, what they got wrong, how they helped design that. We had a discussion about biohacking and genetics versus advanced robotics. What are some of the fears there? Danielle and Astro Teller did that talk, and they talked about, hey, guys, don't be afraid of the technology. The only portion that I was a little bit disappointed in is at the end we had a lot of folks asking similar questions to what you guys are asking and saying, hey, we're concerned about this. And the response was, oh, don't worry about it. Just think positive. Don't think negative. Just think positively about these technologies. But other than that, I thought they did a great job talking about, hey, here's what the technology can actually do, and here's why you shouldn't be afraid of it. So kind of de-escalating those fears and making it more familiar. Just great conversations overall. So if you can get into conferences, workshops, or events like that, you can actually get close to the people that are innovating. Go right up and ask them the hard questions, and they'll come right back at you and give you the answers because they're hands-on, living it every day. That's the best way to learn about this.